Hi everyone, this is our second set of lectures on ecohydrology, and here we're going to be taking some of the content you learned about the water cycle in the previous lecture and applying it to understand drought and water stress in ecosystems. Have a look at this quite fluorescent map of the globe. This map is the result of an interesting analysis by Nemani in 2003, showing which factors are limiting plant growth in different parts of the world. Cold temperatures can slow plant growth in temperate ecosystems, and lack of sunlight can slow plant growth close to the poles, where there's very little sunshine, as well as at the equator, where there's so much cloud that sunshine can't penetrate. However, in the mid-latitudes, between the equator and the poles, water availability is one of the most limiting factors for plants. We can use the concept potential evapotranspiration to try to quantify when water becomes limiting for plant growth. In the previous lecture, you learned about evapotranspiration as a demand-supply problem. So you can think of potential evapotranspiration as being the evapotranspiration when the supply is not limiting. So just the demand side of the equation. So potential evapotranspiration is defined as the water that could be evaporated or transpired if it was available. So it's the energy available to take water into the atmosphere. So hot, dry places have high potential evapotranspiration. The reason we find this useful to quantify is because, as a good rule of thumb, water becomes limiting to plants when PET is greater than precipitation. So when the amount that could go out to the atmosphere if it was there is greater than the amount that's actually coming in, chances are your plants and your ecosystems are going to be water stressed. And the reason it's useful is because it can define water stress in places that are actually very different in terms of temperature. In a hot place, you need more rain to have a positive water balance. Think about that for a little bit. See if you understand it. Here is a map of the United States showing which parts of the country have higher rainfall than potential evapotranspiration. Everything that's green in the east of the country have higher rainfall than potential evapotranspiration. Everything that's red on the west of the country has higher potential evapotranspiration than rainfall. The situation in South Africa is pretty similar. Our annual rainfall in Johannesburg is higher than our annual PET, but in the Karoo, the PET is higher than the rainfall. But that doesn't mean that nothing grows in the Karoo. And this is because there are some times of the year when there's enough rainfall to balance the potential evapotranspiration. So it's better to think of this over time. These climate diagrams are very good ways to visualize the amount of water stress that an ecosystem experiences throughout the year. What you have on the x-axis is the months of the year from January through to January. Well, actually from July, we're in the southern hemisphere, from July, August, September through to July, because in this part, which is in Bolivia, in the southern hemisphere, they have rainfall in December, January, February, just like we do. So that's on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have temperature on one side in red, and you have rainfall on the other side in millimeters. And Walter developed a clever way to scale these two things, so that basically, if the rainfall value goes below the temperature value, then the system is probably water stressed. The PET is greater than the rainfall. So let's have a look at these two sites. They have very different climate diagrams. The site in the diagram on the left always has sufficient water to supply the evaporative demand. The rainfall value is always higher than the temperature value. The site in the diagram on the right only has a positive water balance for approximately 6 months of the year. The rest of the time, the atmospheric demand is greater than the precipitation inputs. So the site on the right only has good environmental conditions for plant growth for about 6 months of the year. All right, so I've spent quite a few slides describing how we quantify water stress and how we assess water stress in ecosystems. But why is water so important? There are two main reasons. Firstly, when it comes to plants, there's a trade-off between water loss and carbon dioxide gain. Photosynthesis can only occur when the stomata are open. But when the stomata are open, it means there's a pathway for water to be lost from the plant. So the conclusion is that plants that are water stressed can't grow. Secondly, there's water loss and cooling. Remember I told you in the previous lecture how evapotranspiration uses energy and cools the surface. So for plants and animals, evaporation is one of the main mechanisms for keeping cool. So the conclusion is that hot and dry environments are a problem for biological growth. All right, so water is important for ecosystems, and then I've showed you how most ecosystems become water stressed at some point. So what happens when plants become water stressed? The first thing that plants will do is they'll close their stomata. That's a mechanism to block the pipe and prevent water loss to the atmosphere. What happens when that happens? They stop photosynthesizing, so there's a trade-off between preventing water loss and growth. Secondly, wilting can occur. We talked about that in the previous lecture. If the water potential is lower than the leaf water potential, leaves can't maintain turgor and they wilt. And thirdly, cavitation can occur if the water stress is really intense. We talked about wilting in the previous lecture when we were defining water potential. So even if a plant closes its stomates, if the water potential of the soil is also low, if you're in a dry soil, then there's a pathway for the loss of water from a plant. However, a plant can easily recover from wilting. If you water a pot plant that is wilted, then the water potential of the soil increases and the water will flow back into the leaves of the plant. Remember, water flows towards the more negative water potential. The third thing that can happen when a plant is water stressed is cavitation. Cavitation occurs when the tension of water within the xylem becomes so great that liquid water vaporizes and dissolved air expands to fill the vessel elements. In this picture, all the red, purple bits are vessel elements that have cavitated. You can imagine that a plant that is under water stress is a bit like a piece of rope in a tug-of-war. You've got the atmospheric demand on the one side, and you've got low soil moisture content on the other. In this situation, the water in the plant can be under great tension, and air can get into the xylem. Now, when cavitation occurs, when you've got air in the xylem, then the pipe is broken, and water can't be transported anymore. So plants have developed ingenious ways to recover from cavitation, but sometimes cavitation can be so big that it can kill a plant, and this is called drought death. Plants have a variety of ways of tolerating or surviving water stress. Some plants have very deep roots for increasing the supply side of the equation. Other plants have succulent leaves or stems that can store water for times of drought. Some plants have very small leaves, and small leaves mean that they don't experience a large evaporative demand. Still more plants can avoid water stress entirely by dropping their leaves when the rains stop. This breaks the pipe so that the plant is no longer having to manage the relative demands of the atmosphere and the soil for water. So these are deciduous plants that drop their leaves. Finally, ephemeral plants only grow when there is water. When there is no water, they wait out the dry period as seeds. And these pictures of these Namaqualand daisies are examples of ephemeral plants. They grow in incredibly arid places that are water stressed for almost all of the year, but in the brief few months when there's water, they will grow and flower and flourish and then set seed, and then the seeds will survive the next water-stressed period. Animals also have interesting solutions to water stress, but they're very different solutions from plants. For example, animals aren't able to store water the way plants do, but they're able to move to find water, as well as to find places that don't have high evaporative demand. So animals can migrate to avoid water stress. They can just move away from water-stressed places. And other animals can get most of the water they need from the plants that they eat. They don't need surface water. They don't need rivers or dams. They just can survive just by the water that's in the plants that they eat. And then I mentioned that evapotranspiration is one of the main ways that animals cool themselves, but it's not the only way that animals can cool themselves. Animals can change their behavior. They can become nocturnal so that they don't get so hot, or they can seek out shade and spend their time in the shade. There are also physiological ways that animals then can cool themselves that don't involve evapotranspiration. Animals in very hot places tend to have light colors that reflect heat, and they can also arrange the blood flow so that blood flows into cooler extremities and then back, so that the center of the animal, the key part of the animal, never gets too hot. Drought stress, however, is inevitable. So let's talk a little bit about where and when you get droughts. So drought is a very difficult concept actually to pin down. Most plants experience some degree of water stress at some point in the year because rainfall is a stochastic process. Water arrives in the system unpredictably as rainfall events, and sometimes there is no rain for several weeks. This is often what physiologists think of as a drought. I would call that a within-season drought, several weeks of reduced soil water. And within-season droughts happen often, and they happen in almost all environments. However, there are also many environments in the world that can have up to 6 months of no rainfall every year, predictably. In fact, here in Johannesburg, we're about to go into a seasonal drought. The organisms that flourish here are adapted to the 6-month drought, and they have mechanisms for surviving it because it actually happens every year. So seasonal droughts can be quite predictable and happen every year in places that are seasonally arid, like much of Africa. In South Africa, we also have good and bad rainfall years. And if we have lower than normal annual rainfall, then this is termed an interannual drought. These can be common occurrences or they can be very rare. When I was in the UK in 2018, Europe was experiencing an interannual drought and it was very unusual. Whereas in South Africa, we get below average rainfall every 7 to 20 years, periodically. Finally, occasionally you get extreme multi-annual droughts, droughts that can go on for several years, where you have several years of below average rainfall in a system. Now, because these don't happen often, they can result in extreme responses of ecosystems, including a lot of drought death. People are still talking about the drought in the 1930s in South Africa, and we will still be talking about the 2014-2015 drought that we've just come out of in 100 years. I've mentioned that drought can sometimes cause tree death. One multi-year drought in northern Australia in the 1990s killed almost all the trees in the ecosystem. You can see this picture that was published in a paper showing all the dead trees. This was an example of an extreme drought for this ecosystem, and the trees did not have mechanisms to survive this drought. People are still trying to work out what kills trees in these sorts of extreme droughts. Some people say it is cavitation and damage to the plant xylem, and other people say it is carbon starvation, because plants can't photosynthesize if they don't have water, so they can literally starve if they run out of stored carbon to keep their metabolisms going. In the Kruger National Park during the 2014-2015 drought, we saw examples of trees that died due to xylem damage, and other trees that died from carbon starvation. But most of the trees actually came through this recent extreme drought without dying. Even though we had 3 years of below average rainfall, most of the trees didn't die. So this is probably evidence that these sorts of droughts are actually quite common in our ecosystems. They might be extreme and they might cause a lot of change to the ecosystem, but there's mechanisms that organisms have to survive it, which means probably these droughts have happened in the past. So animals also die in extreme multi-year droughts. And this is actually part of the natural cycle of their population dynamics. Moreover, it can provide opportunities for plants to grow and recover without being grazed or browsed, but it's very hard to watch. In the Kruger Park, all the hippos just ended up dying during the 2014-2015 drought. You would drive around the park and you'd see these dead hippo carcasses everywhere. I've highlighted this paper, To Cull or Not to Cull, Lessons from a South African Drought. And this was written after an extreme multi-annual drought in the 1980s. Brian Walker, Bob Scholes, Norman Owen-Smith and Richard Emsley were all living and working on game reserves during this drought. Some of the game reserves culled the animals before the drought got too bad, so that the animals wouldn't die because of the drought. Other reserves just left the animal numbers high, and there were a lot of animal deaths during the drought. So if they didn't cull, there was much more death during the drought. than the parks that did cull. However, in the reserves where some of the animals were culled, the grass and the vegetation was more damaged by the drought and took longer to recover. And this was because the animals that weren't culled survived and were able to eat and continued to eat and damage the vegetation all the way through the drought. Whereas in the places where there wasn't culling, the animals died, and that gave the vegetation a bit of a breather. So the conclusion from this paper was that culling the animals prevented an important regenerative process from occurring after the drought. This represents some of the complexities of managing these sorts of ecosystems that are so variable. You have to kind of just accept that when a drought happens, it's part of the natural cycle, and you have to observe it and manage it as best you can, but not try to prevent it. This diagram represents another way to think about droughts in terms of their effects on the socio-economic system. So in these boxes, you have all the impacts of a drought, of reduced rainfall. On the left-hand side, you've got how long the drought is occurring, and on the right-hand side, you've got the definition that people use to define these droughts. So a meteorological drought affects the water balance, but it doesn't typically affect plant production. So this is a short-term drought. An agricultural drought affects plant growth and animal performance. A hydrological drought, on the other hand, affects how much water is in the rivers and the dams. The recent drought in Cape Town was a hydrological drought. So I hope this lecture has been a bit of a break from being a systems ecologist and just thinking about fluxes and stocks into thinking about and understanding why being a systems ecologist is useful. By the end of this lecture, there are a couple of things you need to be able to do. You need to be able to discuss why water is important ecologically. You also need to be able to define potential evapotranspiration and explain how it can be used to determine water stress. Thirdly, you need to be able to describe what happens to plants physiologically as they become more and more water stressed. You need to explain why water stress constrains plants and animals, and describe some adaptations to prevent water stress in plants and in animals. Finally, you need to be able to describe different types of droughts, their impacts, and their occurrence, how often they occur in ecosystems.